During a solo hike, a woman finds a door in the mountains. Behind it is an empty room that shouldn't exist. One detail connects the discovery to something truly terrifying. She opens the door and realizes why this place was hidden. Subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments which city you are watching from. No one remembered the day it happened. That was the cruelest part. It was not a day marked by storms or sirens or anything that would later justify why memory refused to hold on to it. It was an ordinary afternoon, pale and unremarkable, the kind that slipped easily into the background of people's lives. The sky was clear, the playground was full, and children moved in loose, careless patterns that suggested safety rather than danger. Parents stood nearby, distracted by their phones or conversations, trusting the familiar rhythm of swings and slides. Nothing about that day warned anyone that it would fracture a family beyond repair. She had been on duty that morning. Not an emergency shift, not a raid or an arrest, just routine hours that blurred together after years on the force. She remembered promising she would be home early, remembered the way her daughter's face lit up when she said it. That memory stayed sharp, painfully sharp, while everything else from that day became unreliable. The playground had been a short walk from their house, a place she had approved of precisely because it seemed so visible, so ordinary. It never occurred to her that danger would come disguised as something small and sweet, something no one questioned. The candy appeared later in fragments of testimony and blurred recollections. No one could say who dropped it or how long it had been there. It had no wrapper by the time anyone noticed, just a sticky sheen and bright color that drew a child's attention without effort. Children are experts at finding things adults overlook. They see possibility where others see nothing. Her daughter had picked it up with the easy confidence of a child who had never learned fear. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the moment had already passed. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and impatience. She remembered the lights more than the sounds, remembered how the white glare flattened everything into something unreal. Doctors spoke in careful tones that avoided certainty. Tests were ordered, then repeated. Time stretched in ways she did not understand. She stood beside the bed and watched machines translate her daughter's body into numbers, waiting for someone to say something definitive, something she could either fight or accept. Instead, there were pauses, exchanged looks, and phrases that drifted without anchoring themselves to meaning. When the toxicology report finally arrived, it came with language that felt deliberately distant. A psychotropic substance, high concentration, no known prescription source. The words sat on the page like an accusation without a target. She read the report not as a grieving mother, but as a detective, trained to recognize gaps. There were too many of them. The dosage did not make sense for accidental exposure. The form did not match anything commonly circulating in the area. Someone had processed this substance. Someone had prepared it. She hated herself for thinking like that, while her daughter lay motionless. The conflict between her roles became immediate and unbearable. Part of her wanted to scream at the world for its indifference. Another part cataloged details, memorized timelines, searched for patterns. She tried to suppress that instinct, convinced it made her a worse mother, but it did not leave her. It never had. The official investigation began with quiet efficiency and ended the same way. Witnesses were questioned. The playground was inspected. Nothing conclusive surfaced. No cameras covered the right angles. No one remembered seeing anyone suspicious. The candy, already partially dissolved, offered no usable trace. The report slowly shifted in tone, from open inquiry to administrative closure. Accidental ingestion. Unknown origin. Tragic but isolated. She argued. She pushed. She pointed to inconsistencies that would have mattered in any other case. The responses grew more careful, then more distant. She recognized the signs of a system preparing to move on. Resources were limited. Evidence was thin. There were no clear suspects. At some point, a supervisor spoke to her, not as an investigator, but as a colleague who should protect herself from further damage. It was said gently, almost kindly, and it infuriated her. The case was closed on paper long before it closed in her mind. The words, "No criminal liability established," followed her home like a verdict on her own failure. She attended the funeral in a daze, surrounded by people who spoke in hushed tones and avoided her eyes. Condolences piled up without meaning. Everyone assumed time would do what justice had not. Time did nothing of the sort. The year that followed unfolded in a strange, muted sequence. She returned to work because that was what she knew how to do. Her badge still worked. Her desk remained where it had always been. She completed tasks, filed reports, attended briefings. From the outside, she appeared functional. Inside, everything had slowed to a crawl. Sounds arrived late. Emotions arrived later, if at all. She learned how to move through the day without fully inhabiting it. Her colleagues treated her carefully, as if grief were contagious. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. No one mentioned her daughter unless she did first, which she never did. At home, silence became a permanent fixture. Her other children moved quietly, watching her with a mixture of fear and hope. She tried to reassure them with routine, but routines felt hollow. She cooked meals she barely tasted. She helped with homework, while her mind drifted elsewhere. At night, the house seemed too large, every room echoing with absence. Her daughter's room remained untouched. Toys stayed where they had been left. Drawings still clung to the refrigerator door. She told herself she would clean it one day, but each attempt ended before it began. The room had become a boundary she could not cross without unraveling. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams replayed moments she wished she could erase or rewrite. In some, she noticed the candy sooner. In others, she was there when it mattered. Waking brought no relief, only the familiar weight of knowing none of it could be changed. As the months passed, something else took root beneath the grief. A low, steady anger. It was not explosive or dramatic. It was methodical. It focused on unanswered questions and unresolved threads. She reread the case file at night, pretending she was only checking facts she already knew. Each time, the same gaps stared back at her. Someone had benefited from those gaps, remaining gaps. The idea that her daughter's death might have been part of something larger crept in slowly. She resisted it at first, unwilling to add speculation to loss. But patterns did not disappear just because they were inconvenient. She had seen enough cases to know that harm rarely occurred in isolation. It clustered around systems, around repetition, around people who assumed they would never be noticed. The mountains entered her thoughts unexpectedly. They were not a place she associated with answers, only with quiet. Years earlier, she had taken her children there on short trips, simple hikes meant to tire them out and reward them with views they barely appreciated. Those memories felt distant, but intact, untouched by the events that followed. The mountains existed outside her daily world, outside paperwork and reports and polite conversations. They promised something she could not name but desperately needed. When she requested time off, no one questioned it. The department approved it quickly, almost with relief. She packed without enthusiasm, choosing practicality over preparation. She did not map out her route carefully or share details with many people. This was not a vacation. It was an escape, though she refused to call it that. The morning she left, she paused in the doorway of her house longer than necessary. Her children were still asleep. She watched them breathe, memorizing the rise and fall of their chests as if committing proof of life to memory. She did not know what she expected to find in the mountains. She only knew she could not stay where she was. As the road climbed and civilization thinned, the noise inside her head softened. Trees replaced buildings. Cell service weakened. By the time she reached the trailhead, she felt lighter, as if distance itself were doing some of the work she could not. She shouldered her pack and stepped onto the path without ceremony. The forest closed around her, and for the first time in a year, the silence did not feel like an enemy. The first miles passed without resistance. The trail was wide enough to suggest it had once been popular, though now it carried only the occasional footprint, pressed into dry soil. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in broken patterns, moving slowly as the day progressed. She walked at a steady pace, not rushing, not lingering, letting her body settle into the rhythm of movement. Each step seemed to pull her farther from the version of herself that had been standing in the doorway that morning, uncertain and hollow. At first, there were still signs of other people: a discarded bottle near a rock, a faded trail marker nailed into a tree, distant voices that drifted and dissolved before she could place them. She acknowledged them without interest. The presence of others did not bother her, but neither did it comfort her. She had not come to be seen or noticed. She had come to disappear for a while. As the trail climbed, the sounds thinned. The ground grew uneven, forcing her to pay attention to where she placed her feet. Her breathing deepened, the familiar burn in her legs grounding her in the present moment. Physical strain had always been honest. It demanded focus and offered immediate feedback. Pain here was earned, predictable, and temporary. Did not ambush you when you least expected it. With each mile, her thoughts began to surface more clearly. They did not rush at her all at once. They arrived the way fog does, slowly, filling the spaces between trees and rocks. Memories of her daughter appeared without warning. The way she had laughed too loudly. The way she had asked questions that caught adults off guard. The small rituals they shared, now frozen in time. She did not try to push these thoughts away. She let them move through her, trusting that resisting them would only make them sharper. The trail narrowed as it veered away from the main route. She noticed the change almost unconsciously. Years of training had taught her to register deviations without assigning meaning to them immediately. Still, something about this section felt different. The ground here bore signs of neglect. Grass pushed through cracks in the dirt. Fallen branches lay where they had dropped, not cleared by maintenance crews. This was not the path most hikers chose. She paused briefly, consulting the map she carried more out of habit than necessity. According to it, this spur led nowhere significant. No lookout points, no campsites, just a gradual ascent that eventually faded into rough terrain. She considered turning back, returning to the predictable safety of the main trail. Instead, she folded the map and continued on. The forest grew denser. Trees crowded closer together, their trunks darkened by age and moisture. Light struggled to reach the ground, leaving patches of shadow that shifted subtly as the wind moved the canopy above. She felt the familiar prickle at the base of her neck, the sensation of being observed. It was a feeling she knew well, one she had learned not to dismiss, but also not to trust blindly. In cities, it often meant someone was watching. In forests, it usually meant nothing at all. She stopped again, listening. The wind threaded through the branches, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, then fell silent. No footsteps, no voices, nothing that confirmed or denied her unease. She reminded herself that isolation could play tricks on perception. Still, she adjusted her pace, more alert now, scanning her surroundings with the quiet efficiency that had once defined her work. The trail became little more than a suggestion. Stones marked where others might have walked before her, but they were spaced irregularly. as if placed by people who did not expect the path to be followed for long. She noticed signs of human interference that did not align with recreational use: scratches on rocks at unnatural angles, a section of ground where vegetation had been pressed down repeatedly, as if something heavy had passed through more than once. She crouched briefly to examine one such patch. The impressions were old, but not ancient. Whatever had made them had not belonged here long ago, but it had not been recent either. Enough time had passed for nature to begin reclaiming the space, but not enough to erase the disturbance entirely. It was the kind of detail she would have documented automatically in another context. Here, she filed it away, unsure yet of its relevance. As she climbed higher, the air thinned and cooled. Her breath came more sharply now, each inhale cutting a clean line through the quiet. She welcomed the exertion. It left less room for speculation. The further she went, the more the world narrowed to immediate concerns: balance, footing, breath. Yet beneath that focus, a subtle tension persisted, like a thread pulled just tight enough to be felt. She reached a point where the trail appeared to end. Ahead of her, the terrain rose sharply, broken by jagged rock faces that formed a natural barrier. She considered turning back again, telling herself she had gone far enough. Then she noticed something that did not belong: a faint discoloration on the rock wall ahead. Not a shadow, not a natural stain. Metal oxidized by time. She approached slowly, her heart rate increasing not from exertion but from recognition. Set into the rock face was a door. It was not immediately obvious. Someone had tried to disguise it, matching its surface to the surrounding stone as closely as possible. But time had been unkind to that effort. Rust bled through the seams, tracing lines that caught the light at certain angles. The door was rectangular, its edges too precise to be natural. It sat flush with the rock, as if embedded there rather than attached. She stood a few feet away, studying it without touching it. The placement made little sense. This was not a mining entrance. There were no markings, no warning signs, no evidence of official use. It was too small for heavy equipment, too isolated for storage related to legitimate activity. It looked temporary, like something installed quickly with the intention of being forgotten. Her first instinct was to retreat. She was alone, off the main trail, without reliable communication. Whatever this was, it was not her responsibility. She was not on duty. She owed no one answers here. The mountains did not ask questions, but instinct was not the only thing guiding her. Habit played its part. So did a deeper, quieter force she had not yet named. The same force that had kept her rereading a closed case long after everyone else had moved on. The same force that refused to accept that some things simply happened without reason. She stepped closer. The door's surface was cold beneath her fingers, the metal rough where corrosion had taken hold. There was no lock, only a recessed handle worn smooth by use. That detail unsettled her more than anything else. Doors without locks assumed privacy through obscurity, not security. Whoever used this door did not expect to be interrupted. She withdrew her hand and took a breath, steadying herself. The forest around her remained silent, indifferent to her discovery. No alarms sounded. No movement betrayed another presence. She was acutely aware of how small she was in this place, how easy it would be for something to go wrong without anyone ever knowing. She weighed her options with care. Turning back meant leaving this unanswered, consigning it to the category of strange but irrelevant. Opening the door meant crossing an invisible line, one that separated observation from involvement. She thought of the year she had just endured, of the questions that had followed her into every quiet moment. She thought of how many times she had walked away from uncertainty only to regret it later. Her decision came without drama. She reached for the handle again, this time with intention. Whatever lay beyond the door, she would face it not as a police officer or a grieving mother, but as someone who refused to ignore what was placed directly in front of her. The handle moved easily under her grip. As the door began to open, the cool air spilling from within carried with it a faint, unfamiliar scent. She did not yet know what it meant, only that the mountains had offered her something she could no longer refuse. The door opened without resistance, as if it had been waiting for someone to touch it again. The hinges did not creak. That absence of sound unsettled her more than noise would have. Doors that were not meant to be opened often announced themselves. This one did not. It simply yielded, revealing a narrow passage cut directly into the rock. Cool air flowed out, carrying with it a sterile, chemical undertone that did not belong in the mountains. It was faint, but unmistakable, the kind of smell she had encountered before in evidence rooms and temporary labs. Not strong enough to overwhelm, not sharp enough to burn, but present in a way that suggested recent use rather than long abandonment. She hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The light shifted immediately. Outside, the forest had been layered with shadows and motion. Inside, the darkness was static, swallowing depth and distance. She switched on her flashlight, the beam carving a narrow tunnel through the black. The walls were rough stone in some places, reinforced with poured concrete in others. This was not a natural cave adapted for use. It was a space created with purpose, quickly and efficiently, with no concern for aesthetics or permanence. The passage opened into a small chamber, no larger than a modest storage room. It was empty in the most deliberate sense of the word. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but cleared. The floor was swept clean, though faint scuff marks betrayed where objects had once stood. The walls bore the ghosts of fixtures removed in haste, outlines where shelving had been bolted, discolorations where equipment had been mounted and taken down. The ceiling held a ventilation duct that disappeared into a narrow shaft, its edges still sharp, untouched by time. She stood still, allowing her eyes to adjust, allowing her instincts to surface. This was not a place meant for people to linger. It was a waypoint, a node. Somewhere activity happened briefly before moving on. The emptiness spoke of intention, not neglect. She moved slowly around the room, flashlight tracing the perimeter. In one corner, the concrete floor bore shallow scratches, irregular but repeating, as if heavy containers had been dragged rather than lifted. Near the opposite wall, she spotted faint footprints, partial impressions preserved where dust had settled unevenly. The soles were not hiking boots. The tread was flatter, industrial. Whoever came here did not walk trails for leisure. Her pulse remained steady, though she was acutely aware of her isolation. She catalogued details automatically, her mind slipping into a familiar analytical rhythm. She had missed this clarity. Grief dulled everything else. But here, confronted with something concrete, her thoughts sharpened. She crouched near one of the walls and noticed a smear on the concrete, barely visible unless the light hit it at the right angle. She brushed her fingers near it without touching. Residue. Dried. Translucent. Chemical. The ventilation duct above it made sense now. Airflow would have been necessary, even for short periods of work. The deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. This room had not been designed to store large quantities of anything. It had been used to prepare, package, or inspect something before moving it elsewhere. The speed with which it had been cleared suggested that whoever used it had anticipated the need to vanish quickly. She straightened, her flashlight beam sweeping across the floor again, and that was when she saw it. A scrap of color against the gray. Almost missed, almost dismissed as debris. She knelt and picked it up carefully, holding it between her fingers. It was a fragment of candy wrapper. The material was thin, glossy, printed with bright patterns meant to attract a child's eye. Time and moisture had dulled the colors, but the design was unmistakable. Her breath caught, not sharply, but as if something inside her had tightened suddenly. She turned the fragment over, examining the edges. Torn, not cut. Discarded, not placed. Memory surged without warning. The evidence photos from a year ago. The forensic report describing a partially dissolved confection, untraceable by brand, dismissed as generic. At the time, she had argued that someone, somewhere, had made that candy intentionally. She had been told she was reaching. Her hands were steady now, but her thoughts raced. This wasn't proof, not yet. It was coincidence, perhaps. Mountains were not immune to litter. But the wrapper's presence here, in this room, in this context, felt wrong in a way she could not articulate away. She closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself. Emotion would cloud judgment. She needed clarity. She placed the wrapper fragment carefully into a small evidence bag she carried out of habit, something she had almost left behind when packing. The irony did not escape her. As she continued her examination, more details emerged. In a shallow recess near the back wall, she found faint indentations where small containers had been stacked. The size matched nothing recreational, too uniform, too deliberate. She imagined rows of items laid out, processed, then removed. The room had functioned like a heartbeat, pulsing activity in and out, never stopping long enough to be noticed. Her thoughts drifted unwillingly back to the closed case. The language of the report echoed in her mind. Unknown origin. No known distribution channel. She had accepted those conclusions because she had been told to, because there had been no alternative presented. Now, standing here, she realized how fragile that acceptance had been. This place explained something she had never been able to reconcile. The dosage found in her daughter's system had been precise in its own cruel way. Not random. Not accidental contamination. It had been measured, even if the target had not mattered. The candy had not been meant for her child specifically. It had been meant for someone. Anyone. That realization landed with a weight she had not prepared for. The grief she had carried for a year transformed, reshaping itself into something colder. Her daughter had not been taken by chance. She had been taken by indifference, by a system that treated human lives as variables in an equation. She moved to the entrance of the chamber and looked back at the door. From the inside, it looked even more deceptive. The rock framing it had been carefully altered to blend with the natural formation. Someone had wanted this place hidden but accessible. Not permanent enough to invite scrutiny. Not temporary enough to leave traces behind. She considered leaving. She could walk away now, return to the trail. Tell herself this discovery was a curiosity, nothing more. She could bring it to authorities later, anonymously perhaps, and hope it would be taken seriously. But the thought rang hollow. Too many times, hope had been deferred, diluted by procedure. Instead, she stepped back into the chamber and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. She allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of what she had found. The mountains outside were silent witnesses, offering no comfort, no condemnation, just space. She thought of her daughter's face, of the trust with which she had moved through the world. She thought of the other children who might have crossed paths with similar candy, similar traps. The idea that this room was part of a larger network formed slowly, inexorably. No one built infrastructure like this for a single event. No one went to this effort for randomness. Her role shifted in that moment, though she did not yet name it. She was no longer just a hiker who had stumbled upon something strange. She was an observer at the edge of a system that had already claimed one life she loved. The emptiness of the room was not absence, It was evidence. When she finally stood and turned off her flashlight, the darkness felt different, less unknown. She closed the door carefully behind her, restoring the illusion she had disrupted. Outside, the forest resumed its quiet indifference, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her, that she could not leave this behind. The door in the rock had opened something far larger than itself, and she was standing directly in its path. She did not leave the mountains that day. That decision formed quietly, without drama, the way irreversible choices often do. Standing outside the sealed door, she felt the familiar pull of caution urging her to turn back, to treat what she had found as something to be reported later, at a distance, through official channels. That voice sounded reasonable. It always did. It was the same voice that had told her, a year earlier, that some cases simply ended without answers. She ignored it. Instead, she moved away from the rock face and climbed higher, choosing a position that allowed her to observe the surrounding terrain without exposing herself. She selected the spot carefully, guided by instinct, honed over years of surveillance work. From there, the valley opened below her in a series of natural folds and ridges. Nothing obvious stood out at first glance. That, she knew, was the point. As daylight faded, she set up a temporary camp, hidden among low brush and uneven stone. She worked methodically, erasing signs of her presence as she went. The mountains rewarded patience and punished carelessness. She had learned that long before grief ever entered her life. When she finally sat still, listening to the wind move through the trees, she realized she was no longer acting on impulse. She was committing to something. Night brought clarity of a different kind. Sounds carried farther in the dark. A distant engine echoed briefly through the valley before vanishing. She did not see its source, but the sound did not belong. It was too controlled, too mechanical to be mistaken for natural disturbance. She noted the direction, the timing, the way it repeated at irregular intervals. Patterns did not need to be perfect to exist. The following days unfolded slowly. She slept in short intervals, waking often, her senses tuned to subtle changes. During daylight, she explored the surrounding area in widening arcs, careful never to approach the door directly again. She marked features mentally rather than physically. A fallen tree that looked untouched, but had been cut cleanly at the base. A rock formation that bore faint scrape marks inconsistent with erosion. Tire tracks pressed shallowly into soil where no road was supposed to exist. The evidence accumulated not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet confirmations. This was not an isolated structure. It was part of a route. She traced that route with patience, following signs that would have meant nothing to a casual observer. The land bore scars of repetition, paths walked too often to be accidental, yet deliberately avoided by anyone not already aware of them. She moved when visibility favored her, staying low, using the terrain as cover. It felt disturbingly natural, slipping back into habits she had thought grief had dulled beyond use. On the fourth day, she saw movement. From her vantage point, she spotted a figure crossing an exposed section of rock far below. The person moved with purpose, carrying something heavy enough to alter their balance. They disappeared behind a ridge, then re-emerged minutes later, unburdened, walking faster. She did not follow immediately. Observation came before action. Always. She waited until dusk to move closer. The structure revealed itself gradually, almost reluctantly, as if the mountain itself resisted giving it up. It wasn't a building in the traditional sense. No walls stood openly against the sky. No lights marked its presence. Instead, it was carved into the rock, its entrance concealed behind a natural outcrop that could easily be mistaken for solid stone unless approached from the correct angle. The entrance was larger than the door she had found days earlier, wide enough to allow vehicles to pass through in stages. Tracks confirmed it. Whatever was moved in and out of this place required more than human strength. The mountain had been hollowed just enough to accommodate a purpose that valued efficiency over permanence. She positioned herself where she could observe without being seen, and waited. Activity followed no predictable schedule. Vehicles arrived singly, never in groups, always at different times. Their engines cut off before reaching the entrance, coasting the final distance in silence. The people who emerged worked quickly, unloading sealed containers and moving them inside. No one lingered. No one spoke unnecessarily. This was not a place where mistakes were tolerated. Through careful observation, she began to understand the function of the site. This was not a warehouse meant to hold large quantities of product. It was a transitional space, a point where materials were divided, altered, prepared, then sent elsewhere. Smaller shipments moved out than came in. The math was clear. This place existed to transform. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She recalled the lab reports from her daughter's case, the unusual composition, the precision of the dosage. At the time, experts had insisted it was anomalous, an unfortunate convergence of unknown factors. Watching the operation now, she understood how deliberate that precision had been. The substances processed here were tested in controlled increments, their effects measured indirectly through real-world exposure. Candy was not chosen by accident. It was cheap, accessible, untraceable once consumed. It passed easily through public spaces without raising suspicion. Children were not the target, but they were not excluded either. To the people running this operation, that distinction meant nothing. Her grief shifted again, deepening into something sharper. The loss she had endured was no longer abstract or isolated. It was connected to a system that thrived on invisibility and indifference. This place did not mourn the damage it caused. It did not even acknowledge it. She documented everything she could from a distance: timings, routes, behaviors. She memorized faces, movements, habits. She noted which vehicles arrived empty and left full, and which did the opposite. Slowly, a network took shape in her mind, extending far beyond the mountains. One night, as she adjusted her position to maintain cover, she noticed something that chilled her more than anything else she had seen so far. A familiar insignia, barely visible on a crate being moved inside. It was small, almost deliberately obscured, but she recognized it instantly. It was associated with a legitimate chemical supplier, one that operated under strict regulatory oversight. This was not a fringe operation. It was not surviving in the shadows by accident. It was being fed. The implication was devastating. Someone had signed off on shipments. Someone had looked the other way. Someone had ensured that when questions arose, they would be redirected or silenced. She thought back to the ease with which her daughter's case had been closed, to the polite refusals and procedural barriers she had encountered. The connections were no longer hypothetical. She understood then why the smaller room existed. The door she had found was a buffer, a disposable node designed to absorb risk. If compromised, it could be abandoned without exposing the core operation. The warehouse in the mountain was the heart, protected by layers of misdirection and silence. Staying any longer increased her risk. She knew that. The longer she observed, the greater the chance she would be noticed. Already, she sensed changes in behavior. Guards shifted their patterns. Vehicles lingered less. Something about the rhythm had altered. They were aware of disruption. She prepared to leave the observation point, intending to retreat and reassess, when she saw a figure pause and look directly toward her position. The distance was too great to confirm recognition, but instinct flared hot and immediate. She did not move. She did not breathe. After a long moment, the figure turned away. It was enough. As she descended the mountain under cover of darkness, she accepted what she had already known since finding the wrapper fragment. There would be no safe way to bring this to light through conventional means. The people involved were insulated by power, by legitimacy, by the assumption that no one would look closely enough to connect the pieces. She had looked, and once you saw something this clearly, there was no returning to ignorance. The mountains closed behind her as she moved away, their silence unchanged. But she carried with her the weight of what lay hidden within them, and the certainty that the door she had opened could never truly be closed again. Leaving the mountains did not bring relief. As she descended, moving carefully along routes she had memorized rather than marked, she felt the weight of what she carried settle deeper into her body. This was no longer just knowledge, it was responsibility, the kind that did not allow for delay or doubt. Every step away from the hidden warehouse felt like a step toward a confrontation she could no longer avoid. By the time she reached the outskirts of civilization, her mind was already racing through possibilities. Reporting what she had seen through official channels would be the simplest option on paper. It would also be the most dangerous. She understood that now with a clarity that bordered on inevitability. The operation she had uncovered did not survive on secrecy alone. It survived on protection. Someone had ensured that oversight failed, that irregularities were smoothed over, that inconvenient questions disappeared into administrative silence. She had seen that machinery at work before. She had been crushed by it. The memory of her daughter's case returned with painful precision. The way supervisors had shifted uncomfortably when she pushed too hard. The way evidence requests had stalled without explanation. The subtle suggestions that she should step back, take time, focus on healing. At the time, she had believed it was compassion. Now she recognized it as containment. She did not go home immediately. Instead, she rented a small room in a town that existed mostly to serve travelers passing through. It offered anonymity and time. From there, she began to organize what she had gathered. Notes written in shorthand, timelines reconstructed from memory, descriptions of faces and vehicles repeated until they etched themselves permanently into her mind. She transferred everything she could into digital form, encrypting it with a level of care she had rarely needed in her career. Each piece alone was circumstantial. Together, they formed a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Still, she knew how fragile truth could be when exposed too early. Evidence vanished. Witnesses recanted. Narratives were reshaped to fit acceptable outcomes. She needed leverage, and leverage required patience. She reviewed her contacts, mentally discarding names as quickly as they surfaced. Too close to the system, too invested, too compromised. Trust had become a scarce resource, one she rationed carefully. Eventually, one name remained. An investigative journalist she had crossed paths with years earlier during a corruption case that had nearly imploded before it reached print. The journalist had survived that experience by learning how to protect sources and data with equal rigor. The decision to reach out was not easy. Once she did, there would be no turning back. She would no longer control the pace or direction of what followed. But control was an illusion she had already lost. She made contact indirectly, using methods she had not employed since undercover work early in her career. The response came hours later, brief and cautious. A time was set. A location chosen for its neutrality. Before she could act on it, the pressure began. It started subtly. A missed call from an unrecognized number. Then another. Emails that contained no threats, but asked questions she had not shared with anyone. Someone was checking, measuring, testing boundaries. The message was clear without being explicit. She was not as invisible as she thought. Her instincts sharpened instantly. She altered routines, changed locations, avoided predictable patterns. Sleep became fragmented, her mind alert even in exhaustion. She knew the signs of surveillance, and while she could not confirm it outright, the absence of confirmation did not reassure her. The operation she had observed had adapted quickly once disrupted. It was reasonable to assume they were doing the same now. One evening, as she left the building where she was staying, she noticed a vehicle parked across the street that had not been there before. It was unremarkable in every detail, which made it remarkable. She walked past without looking directly at it, relying on peripheral awareness. The engine started moments later, not following. Not yet. Just reminding her of its presence. Fear arrived then, fully formed and unapologetic. Not the abstract fear she had lived with since her daughter's death, but immediate, physical fear. The kind that demanded action. She understood that the mountains had given her time. Civilization would not be as forgiving. She accelerated her plans. The meeting with the journalist took place in a crowded cafe where anonymity was easy and conversations blurred together. She spoke calmly, presenting her findings without embellishment. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not speak of her daughter at first. She focused on logistics, on evidence, on the patterns that suggested systemic abuse rather than isolated crime. The journalist listened without interruption, taking notes sparingly, eyes sharp with recognition. When she finally mentioned her daughter, she did so without emotion, stating the connection as fact rather than plea. The silence that followed was heavy, but purposeful. They both understood the implications. Arrangements were made quickly. Copies of data were transferred to secure locations. Dead man switches discussed and implemented. The story would not run immediately. Verification took time. Protection took longer. But the machinery was in motion now, and it did not rely solely on her survival. That knowledge offered a strange comfort. The attempt to silence her came sooner than she expected. It happened on a narrow stretch of road outside town, late enough that traffic was sparse, but not absent. She noticed the vehicle behind her matching speed, closing distance. The maneuver that followed was calculated, designed to appear accidental. A sudden swerve, a forced correction, the kind of crash that could be attributed to fatigue or poor visibility. Years of training saved her life. She reacted without hesitation, braking hard, steering into the slide rather than away from it. Her car spun, scraped metal screaming against asphalt, before coming to rest inches from a guardrail. The other vehicle did not stop. It did not need to. She sat there for a long moment, hands shaking on the wheel, breath coming in sharp bursts. Pain radiated through her shoulder, but nothing felt broken. She was alive. That fact alone carried meaning now. Emergency responders arrived eventually. Questions were asked, statements taken. She gave nothing away. Accidents happened after all. The narrative was ready-made. In the days that followed, the story began to surface. Carefully at first, an investigation into regulatory oversight, anomalies in chemical distribution, anonymous sources citing patterns of misuse. No names yet. No direct accusations. Just enough light to draw attention. Then came the escalation. Law enforcement agencies not previously involved were pulled in. Warrants issued. The mountain warehouse was raided. What they found confirmed what she had already known. Equipment, records, evidence of long-term operation, attempts to destroy data that came too late. The revelation rippled outward, pulling more into its wake. Companies scrambled to distance themselves. Officials resigned quietly. Some fought back, but the paper trail was unforgiving. Once exposed, the system could not fully protect itself. Her daughter's case was reopened officially within weeks. The language used was cautious, apologetic. Mistakes acknowledged. Oversight failures admitted. It was not justice in the pure sense. It did not undo the past. But it was recognition, and recognition mattered. She watched the news coverage from a distance, avoiding public attention. Her name did not surface, and that was by design. Protection came at the cost of anonymity, a trade she accepted willingly. Her career, however, did not survive intact. Internal reviews questioned her actions, her judgment. She was placed on indefinite leave, her future uncertain. Strangely, the loss of that identity did not devastate her. She had already lost more than any profession could define. When she finally returned home, her children greeted her cautiously, as if unsure whether she would stay. She gathered them into an embrace that felt both fragile and fierce. For the first time in a year, she spoke openly about their sister, not in fragments or euphemisms, but as someone whose life had mattered beyond statistics and reports. At night, when the house was quiet, she thought of the mountains, of the door in the rock, of the emptiness that had spoken louder than any confession. She understood now that truth did not always bring peace. Sometimes it brought danger. Sometimes it demanded sacrifice. But lies demanded more, and she had already paid that price once. The aftermath did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, in waves that carried both relief and exhaustion, as if the world itself needed time to absorb what had been forced into the light. The exposure of the operation did not end with the raid in the mountains. It spread outward, touching places that had once seemed untouchable, revealing how deeply the network had embedded itself into structures people trusted by default. She followed the developments from a distance, not out of fear, but necessity. Visibility was no longer safe, nor was it required. The evidence now existed independently of her. It moved through courtrooms, agencies, and media channels with a momentum that no single person could stop. Files were unsealed. Names appeared in print that had never been associated with scandal before. Carefully maintained reputations fractured under scrutiny. What struck her most was not the outrage, but the surprise. People spoke as if the truth were an anomaly rather than an inevitability, as if systems failed only when someone malicious interfered, rather than because indifference made space for harm to grow. She recognized that reaction well. It mirrored her own disbelief a year earlier, when she had first realized how easily her daughter's case had been dismissed. The official review of that case concluded with language far more careful than she would have chosen. The report acknowledged procedural errors, missed connections, and failures of interdepartmental communication. It stopped short of calling the death intentional, but it removed the word accidental entirely. That absence mattered. It shifted responsibility from fate to structure, from chance to choice. She received the notice in the mail without ceremony, a single envelope among bills and advertisements. She opened it at the kitchen table, hand steady, and read it once without reaction. Then she read it again, slower this time, letting the words settle. There was no apology attached. Institutions rarely apologized in ways that carried weight. Still, the revision altered something fundamental. Her daughter's life was no longer reduced to an unfortunate footnote. It had become part of a documented pattern, a catalyst for change rather than a statistical outlier. That knowledge did not bring closure. It brought something quieter, more sustainable. A sense that the silence she had endured for a year had finally been answered, even if the response was imperfect. Her professional future resolved itself without confrontation. The department framed her departure as a mutual decision. She was offered early retirement benefits, counseling resources, and a carefully worded commendation that avoided specifics. She accepted without protest. Fighting for reinstatement would have required energy she no longer wished to spend on preserving an identity that no longer fit. Without the structure of her career, days initially felt unanchored. She found herself awake early, habits ingrained too deeply to shed overnight. Gradually, she built new routines around her children. Mornings became slower. Evenings were spent at the table, rather than in separate rooms. Conversations unfolded without urgency, without the sense that time was always being stolen by something else. Her children changed in small but meaningful ways. They asked questions again. They laughed more freely. They spoke about their sister without lowering their voices. Grief remained, but it no longer dominated every space. It shared room with memory, with affection, with the possibility of forward motion. Weeks passed before she returned to the mountains. The decision surprised her when she recognized it for what it was. She did not feel drawn back by obligation or unfinished business. She returned because the place had become part of her story. And stories, she believed, deserved to be acknowledged where they began. She chose the same trail, walking it with the same measured pace, though her body felt different now. Lighter, perhaps, or simply less resistant. The forest greeted her without ceremony. Trees stood as they always had. Wind moved through branches with familiar indifference. Nature did not remember or forget. It simply endured. The door in the rock remained where she had left it, though it no longer hid itself as effectively. Official markings framed its edges now. A seal indicated it had been processed, catalogued, rendered harmless. The illusion of secrecy had been stripped away, replaced by the blunt visibility of consequence. She stood before it for a long time, not touching it, not opening it again. From the outside, it appeared smaller than she remembered, less imposing. She understood then that the door itself had never been the threat. It had only concealed one. She thought of the room beyond it, of its deliberate emptiness, of how absence had revealed more than presence ever could. That space had spoken to her because she had been willing to listen, because grief had sharpened her attention rather than dulling it entirely. The mountains were quiet, but the quiet no longer pressed against her. It existed alongside her rather than above her, no longer demanding interpretation. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with cold air, and felt a sense of completion that did not require ceremony. Before leaving, she placed her hand briefly against the rock beside the door. It was not a gesture of farewell or forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Some truths were not meant to be buried again once uncovered. They were meant to stand, visible and imperfect, as reminders of what happened when no one paid attention. As she descended, she did not look back. Life did not become easier in any simple way. The world remained complicated, systems flawed, justice uneven. She did not expect otherwise. What had changed was her relationship to those realities. She no longer believed that silence equaled safety, or that acceptance equaled peace. At home, she packed away the last of her daughter's belongings with care rather than avoidance, not to erase her presence, but to make room for memory that did not wound. The room transformed slowly, becoming a space that honored what had been rather than freezing it in time. In the evenings, when the house settled into quiet, she sometimes thought of the first moment she had seen the door in the rock, how close she had come to walking away, how easily she might have dismissed it as irrelevant. The thought humbled her. It reminded her how many doors existed in the world, unnoticed, waiting for someone willing to open them. She understood now that not every loss could be answered with truth, and not every truth could be pursued without cost. But she also understood something else, something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Silence was not neutral. The door in the mountains had been closed, sealed, and rendered harmless. But what it represented remained open, a quiet challenge to anyone willing to see it. And she had learned, at great cost, that sometimes all it took to change everything was a single refusal to turn away. If this story moved you, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to see the next chapters and more stories like this. Watch the other videos on the channel to continue the journey. And if you think someone else should hear this story, share it with them.